You were taught how to follow instructions, how to meet expectations, how to avoid mistakes. But no one really taught you how to grow. No one explained that growth is uncomfortable, that it feels slow, uncertain, and often invisible. So when you face resistance, when things do not click immediately, your first reaction is to assume something is wrong. You think you are failing, when in reality, you are finally entering the process. From a psychological perspective, your mind was conditioned for clarity and quick feedback. School, social systems, and even daily life reward immediate results. You do something right, you get a response. You do something wrong, you correct it quickly. That creates a pattern. But real growth does not follow that structure. It is delayed. You repeat actions without seeing change. You invest effort without immediate reward. And because you were not trained to handle that delay, your brain interprets it as a problem. So you stop. Not because you lack potential, but because you misread the process. Growth in the beginning feels like stagnation. It feels like you are putting in effort and nothing is happening. But what is actually happening is internal construction. Your mind is adapting, adjusting, building new patterns that are not yet visible. And this is where most people quit. They expect external proof too early. They look for results before the structure is ready. And when they do not see it, they assume it is not working. But it is. You are not wrong for struggling in something you never understood. You are not guilty for not growing when no one showed you how the process actually works. But now you know. And once you understand that growth is slow, repetitive, and often invisible at first, something changes. Quitting is no longer confusion. It becomes a choice. You are putting in effort, but nothing changes. You try, you repeat, you push yourself, and still, you feel stuck. That is where frustration begins, because effort alone is not enough. Most people believe that doing more will automatically lead to improvement. More time, more attempts, more intensity. But without awareness, effort becomes repetition without direction. From a psychological perspective, your brain can reinforce the same pattern over and over if you do not interrupt it. You can keep making the same mistake, thinking the same way, reacting the same way, and call it effort, while nothing actually evolves. That is the trap. You move, but you do not change. Awareness is what breaks that cycle. It is the ability to observe what you are doing while you are doing it. To notice your patterns, your reactions, your mistakes in real time. Without that, you are operating on autopilot. And autopilot does not improve. It only repeats. This is why some people spend years trying and stay in the same place while others evolve faster with less time. The difference is not effort. It is attention. When you become aware, effort becomes intentional. You stop doing things blindly and start adjusting. You refine instead of repeating. You correct instead of continuing the same pattern. And that is where growth begins. Because growth is not about how much you do. It is about how consciously you do it. Once you see your patterns clearly, you cannot ignore them anymore. And from that moment, staying the same is no longer unconscious. It becomes a decision. You think you are failing because it feels hard. Because you are not seeing results. Because every step forward seems to come with resistance. And in your mind, struggle starts to look like a sign that something is wrong. But struggle is not failure. From a psychological perspective, struggle is a natural response to something new. Your brain is trying to adapt, to build new pathways, to understand what it has not mastered yet. That process is not smooth. It is messy, slow, and often frustrating. That is what growth feels like. The problem is not the struggle. The problem is what you do when it appears. Most people interpret difficulty as a stop signal. They feel resistance and assume they are not capable, not ready, or not meant for it. So they step back, they pause, they quit. But struggle is not telling you to stop. It is showing you that you are in the right place. Stopping is different. Stopping is when you break the process, when you interrupt the repetition, when you walk away before the adaptation is complete. And once you stop, everything you are building begins to fade. This is where progress is lost. Because growth requires continuity. It needs you to stay long enough for change to take form. And every time you stop too early, you reset that process. The difference is simple, but it changes everything. Struggling means you are still in it. Stopping means you chose to leave it. And once you understand that, discomfort no longer feels like failure. It feels like part of the path you need to stay on. You stop before it works. Not because it cannot work, but because you expect results sooner than they are supposed to appear. In the beginning, everything feels uncertain. You put in effort, but nothing changes. You repeat actions, but there is no visible progress. And your mind starts questioning the process. From a psychological perspective, your brain is constantly looking for feedback. It wants confirmation that what you are doing is effective. When that confirmation does not come, it creates doubt. And doubt leads to withdrawal. Most people do not quit at the end. They quit in the middle, right at the point where things start to matter, but before results become visible. This is the critical phase. Because real growth happens beneath the surface first. Your habits are adjusting, your thinking is shifting, your internal structure is being built. But none of that is immediately visible, so it feels like nothing is happening. And that is where the mistake happens. You interpret invisibility as failure. You assume that because you cannot see progress, it does not exist. And based on that assumption, you stop. But stopping interrupts everything you were building. From a behavioral standpoint, consistency over time is what creates change. Not intensity, not occasional effort, but sustained repetition. And quitting too early breaks that continuity. This is why so many people stay in the same place. Not because they are incapable, but because they never stay long enough for the process to complete. If they had continued, the result would have appeared, but they chose to leave before it had the chance. And once you understand that, you start to see quitting differently. It is not protection, it is interruption. You try to avoid pain as if it means something is wrong, as if discomfort is a signal that you should stop, change direction, or give up. But pain is not the problem. It is part of the process. From a neurological perspective, your brain resists change because change requires energy. It creates tension, uncertainty, and discomfort. That is why growth feels heavy. Not because you are doing it wrong, but because you are doing something new. Pain appears when you are stretching beyond your current limits, when you are forcing your mind to adapt, to learn, to operate differently. And that pressure is necessary. Without it, nothing changes. Most people experience that discomfort and immediately step back. They look for relief instead of understanding what is happening. They reduce the pressure, return to what is familiar, and call it a break. But what they are really doing is avoiding the process. Pain is not there to stop you. It is there to show you that you are in the middle of transformation. It reveals where you are weak, where you lack control, where you need to improve. And if you face it instead of escaping it, it becomes a tool. This is where mindset is built. Not in moments of ease, but in moments where everything feels difficult and you choose to continue anyway. Because when you learn to stay present in discomfort, it loses its ability to control you. And once that happens, you stop seeing pain as something to avoid. You start seeing it as something to use. You expect change to be visible quickly. You want to see results, feel improvement, confirm that what you are doing is working. And when that does not happen, you assume you are failing. But slow progress is not failure. It is the process working. From a psychological perspective, your brain is biased toward visible outcomes. It values what it can measure, what it can see, what it can confirm. When progress is internal, subtle, or delayed, it struggles to recognize it. So it labels it as nothing. And that is where the mistake happens. Because most real growth happens beneath the surface first. Your thinking starts to shift, your reactions begin to change, your awareness increases. But none of that creates immediate external results. So you feel stuck. You compare your current state to your expectations and the gap feels like failure. But the gap is not failure. It is the distance between process and outcome. And that distance takes time. Most people quit here. Not because nothing is happening, but because what is happening is not yet visible. They expect external proof before internal construction is complete. And when they do not see it, they stop. But stopping is what turns slow progress into no progress. If you continue, that internal change eventually becomes external. Your behavior shifts, your results improve, your structure becomes stronger. But only if you stay. Because progress is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, gradual, almost invisible. And if you cannot recognize it, you will abandon it. When you give up, something inside you relaxes. The pressure disappears, the discomfort fades, and for a moment, it feels like you made the right decision. That relief is real. But it is temporary. From a psychological perspective, giving up removes tension. Your brain no longer has to deal with uncertainty, effort, or the risk of failure. It returns to a familiar state where nothing is being challenged. And that feels safe. But that safety has a cost. The moment you stop, you interrupt everything you were building. The effort you invested, the patterns you were starting to change, the structure that was forming internally, all of it loses continuity. You do not just pause progress, you weaken it. Because growth requires consistency. It needs repetition over time to stabilize. And when you quit, you break that sequence. The relief you feel is the absence of pressure, not the presence of progress. That is the illusion. You trade short-term comfort for long-term stagnation. And the more you repeat this pattern, the stronger it becomes. Your brain learns that quitting is a solution, that whenever things get difficult, the way out is to stop. Over time, this becomes automatic. You do not even question it anymore. But here is the shift. Relief is not always a sign you made the right decision. Sometimes it is a sign you escaped too early. Because real growth does not feel like relief in the moment. It feels like pressure that you learn to handle. And if you always choose relief, you will never reach the point where pressure turns into strength. At first, you do not know. You repeat patterns, make the same mistakes, react automatically. And in that stage, you are not fully responsible because you are not aware of what you are doing. But once you see it, everything changes. From a psychological perspective, awareness shifts control. The moment you recognize your patterns, your excuses, your behaviors, they stop being unconscious. They become visible. And once something is visible, you cannot pretend it is not there. This is where responsibility begins. Not before you knew, but after you understand. You see that you are delaying, that you are avoiding, that you are stopping too early. You recognize the exact moments where you could act differently. And in those moments, you have a choice. Most people try to ignore this stage. Because responsibility removes excuses. It becomes harder to say, "I didn't know," or "I couldn't do it," when you clearly see what is happening. And that creates pressure, because now the outcome depends on your decision. But that pressure is necessary. It forces you to take control of your actions instead of just reacting to them. Responsibility is not about blaming yourself. It is about recognizing your role in your own process. Understanding that your decisions, repeated over time, are what shape your results. And once you accept that, something shifts. You stop waiting for change to happen. You start creating it. Because now, when you quit, you know you are quitting. When you delay, you know you are delaying. And that awareness makes every action intentional. This is the turning point. The moment where growth stops being accidental and becomes a choice. You push hard for a few days, maybe a few weeks. You feel motivated, focused, committed. You give everything you have, and for a moment it feels like you are finally changing. Then you stop. The intensity disappears, your energy drops, and the process breaks. And when it breaks, everything you were building starts to fade. This is the pattern. From a behavioral perspective, intensity creates spikes, consistency creates structure, and only one of them leads to lasting change. Your brain does not adapt to occasional effort. It adapts to repeated behavior. What you do consistently becomes your default. What you do occasionally disappears. This is why short bursts of effort feel powerful but rarely produce results. They are not sustained. Consistency is different. It is not about doing everything at once. It is about doing what matters, repeatedly, even when you do not feel like it. Even when there is no immediate reward. Even when it feels slow. And that is what makes it difficult. Because consistency requires you to act without relying on emotion. It requires you to continue without constant motivation. Most people prefer intensity because it feels stronger. It feels like progress. But intensity without continuity leads to nothing. Consistency, even at a lower level, builds over time. It compounds. Each action reinforces the next. Each repetition strengthens the pattern. And slowly, what felt difficult becomes natural. That is how mindset is built. Not in moments of high energy, but in moments where nothing pushes you forward except your decision to continue. Because in the end, it is not about how hard you can go for a short time. It is about how long you can sustain the process without stopping. At some point, everything becomes clear. Not easy, not comfortable, but clear. You understand the process. You know that growth is slow, that discomfort is part of it, that consistency matters more than intensity. You see your patterns, your excuses, your moments of hesitation. And from that point on, the outcome is no longer uncertain. It becomes a decision. From a psychological perspective, once awareness is established, behavior becomes intentional. You are no longer acting blindly. You know exactly when you are choosing to continue and when you are choosing to stop. That is the truth most people avoid. They want to believe that something external is holding them back. Lack of time, lack of resources, lack of opportunity. And while those factors exist, they are not what defines the end. The end happens when you decide to stop, not when it gets hard, not when progress slows, not when doubt appears. Those are all part of the process. They do not end anything unless you let them. You end it. Every time you walk away before the result, every time you break consistency, every time you choose relief over continuation, you are not being stopped. You are stopping. And that realization is uncomfortable because it removes every excuse. It places the responsibility entirely on you. It shows you that your limits are not just imposed, they are also chosen. But that is also where your power is. Because if you are the one who decides to stop, you are also the one who can decide to continue. You are not locked in your current state. You are not fixed in your current results. The process is still available. The only question is whether you stay in it. Because growth does not decide when it ends. You do.